Hi, everyone. My name is Jahic. I'm a film and econ dual degree here at BU. My professor, or my advisor, is Professor Raymond Fisman. He's a behavioral and corruption economist here at BU. And my study is called Group Identity and Corruption, Responses to Corruption and a Model of Information Processing. So a lot of people are very confused about what behavioral economics exactly is. But essentially, it's trying to solve this problem of standard economics, which is the idea that, which assumes that every single person acts rationally at all times. I think that we can all agree that that doesn't happen, even close to all the time. So a lot of these things that we see on the brain are things that we see that people do that we don't account for. And then the behavioral economists try to make models that account for this. So like loss aversion, the idea that people are much more fearful of losing than they are of relative gains. Regret and overconfidence, but the one that we're going to focus most on is rules of thumb, which is also called heuristics, or the ways that people process information that aren't exactly Bayesian. And Bayesian is like essentially talking about Bayes' rule, or the idea of mathematically and statistically proper updating of beliefs. And a lot of people aren't really great at doing that. So corruption, a lot of people ask me why corruption. Corruption is very, very puzzling. Because everybody all the time agrees that corruption is not a good thing. I think that there's not really any debate on this. People don't like corruption. But it consistently leads to a lack of electoral consequences. So even when we see allegations of corruption against politicians across the world, it doesn't really change how people vote behaviors, or unless it's a really big, large-scale article, but then it becomes usually partisan based and stuff like that. So former literature has theorized two reasons why that's the case. And the one is that the impact of partisanship. So people are still willing to vote for an incumbent if he's corrupt because he's from the same party as them, rather than the person who's competing against him. And the other one is that people just don't really care as much as they pretend to care. So they show socially that they're like, oh yes, we care about corruption, but they don't actually act in that way. So our paper is two parts, or my paper, I guess, is two parts. So first is an experimental analysis. So we conduct an experiment, and we do an analysis of how people respond to criticism, specifically when the criticism is in the form of allegations of corruption. And the second part is a proof-based mathematical analysis of a proposed model of information processing that accounts for the things that people do wrong that the Bayesian model doesn't account for. So the experiment was an online survey. 600 Americans took it between 18 and 65. They were compensated for their time. It's generally representative. We have a little bit left-leaning and a little bit lower income than the general population, but we're able to control for these factors. So we don't think that our analysis is necessarily wrong, or that our sample is very wrong. So there's three groups. There's the control group, where they got no information about the politician's political party or the source's political party. And then as you see, the two treatments got some different level of that information. So first, everyone answered demographic questions. Then they all read 4 articles that were comparable about corrupt politicians or allegedly corrupt politicians. And these articles also include a nudge component, which essentially is like another signal that can go in either direction, saying whether or not that article is likely to be true or not. And we know that these are comparable, that I've successfully made them comparable, because when we look at the control group, we don't see any differences in how people responded to each one. And then lastly, there was opinion and beliefs questions, which kind of take the general idea, or like general opinions of these people. So quickly, I'm going to define what beliefs and preferences are. Beliefs are a participant's thought about any one thing. Let's say if it's a product, I think that it's a good product or a bad product. But preferences are the kind of internal ranking system that we have for such things. So like if there's 5 products, preferences would be which one we like from highest to least, and beliefs would be our thoughts about each individual product, kind of independently of each other. So our first result. So first we look at kind of how we see people responding to corruption, just to see if our sample reflects previous literature, but also just to kind of develop more understanding of how people of different parties react. So in general, Democrats, so a higher score in any of these things represent a more lenient view of the politician. So Democrats, based on their higher blue lines on the left, thought that the severity of the actions was not as high as Republicans did. So Republicans thought that the actions that these politicians did were more severe, but they were still more willing to support these politicians than Democrats were on average, which kind of shows the beginning of this disconnect that we'll show in this next slide, which is our results about the electoral consequences of corruption. So it's kind of hard to see, so I'm going to step away just a little bit and try to show it over there. What we see is that opinion of a politician and the willingness to support that politician is not at all correlated with the likelihood of guilt, but severity is, so the severity of the act, and the same is true for severity, but neither of these are at all correlated with willingness to support, which we see here by the lack of the stars. So we see that essentially someone thinking that an act that a politician did was more severe or and that there was more likely that they were guilty did not at all change how they were going to vote for that person or not. And it also shows the beginning of like kind of irrational thought process, because more severe acts happen less often than less severe acts. So we should expect that likelihood of guilt to go down, but they're positively correlated. So we'll kind of get into that more in a little bit. So when we bring in the source and the politician, we see these really grand changes in how people respond, which we don't see in the control group or in the treatment group, which in the first treatment group when the source is not known. So here on the left, we see Vignette 2 and Vignette 4, which is our Article 2 and Article 4. And Article 2 and Article 4 have the same identity of politicians, but the identity of the source differs. So for Article 2, it's Fox News, and then Article 4, it's MSNBC. In the treatment group where this isn't known, there's no difference in how people respond, but here we see a difference, and so we know for sure that the difference is based on the inclusion of the source, essentially saying that people are they trust it less when they trust the source less when it's out group than they do when it's in group. And that's also reflected in the right between V1 and V2, because if we look at the same result without the source, the responses are much less polarized. But here we see a much more much larger polarization between responses. And then when we bring in the nudge, I know I'm kind of running out of time here, we do see that the nudge leads to a change in level. So people do change their beliefs when they're given a second signal, and that this signal is not always rational, which leads us to the last slide, this very confusing model, which essentially incorporates the different ways that people make mistakes when they're receiving signals and updating their information. So essentially what this says, the zeta t is the beliefs after the period t, so beliefs after receiving the signals. The zeta that's next to it is their initial beliefs. And then essentially everything in these parentheses is how they respond to each signal that they receive, and how they weigh it differently based on their biases. I'd be happy to go into this for a whole 15-minute talk if I had the time. But yeah, it's very confusing stuff, but it's also really useful. In the paper, I explain the economic consequences of this model, so like how we can use it to improve other economic models that exist. Thank you, guys. Do we have time for questions? Okay, cool.
Questions?
Yeah, any questions?
Thank you. Can you explain what the additional nudge in the different articles was that was impacting people's opinions?
Sure. So essentially, the first article that they receive is an article suggesting that they did do this corrupt act, and then the nudge was another signal that they received that could have suggested that they did do it or that they didn't do it, and it had a different source. So the point of that was to show or kind of see if people actually do respond to another nudge, and if they change if that response is based on the source as well. And we see that is the case. And what I think is most interesting about that is that people responded, like there's some people who responded to the article in a rational way, like incorporating the biases of sources and understanding that they're biased towards or against a politician. Those same people reacted to the nudge in a rational way, and the people who didn't respond rationally to the first article also responded irrationally to the second one, which essentially shows that people have varying levels of sophistication or naiveness of their biases.
Great presentation.
Oh,
you
thank you.
you talked a lot about in-group and out-group, and kind of how that influences how people like rationalize their decisions and like the severity of corruption. How can you relate that kind of to your field and expertise in economics, and kind of explain how that would transfer over?
So, well, I think what interested me most about this process is that idea of kind of groupness. It's really a concept that is the cornerstone of behavioral economics or social preferences. So having worked with Professor Fismid for 2 years and talked about his work as a behavioral economist, that's kind of where the expertise came from, and the desire to do a project like this. But I think that, I think the understanding or the idea that like our relationship or position inside of some groups and outside of other groups like hugely impacts how we see ourselves, and standard economic modeling just doesn't kind of think about that at all. So I thought it was interesting to include that. All right, thank you guys.